She's said to be devastated by a report alleging her husband has been what is being called a cross-dressing double life.
In March 2026, cameras were fixed on a tense congressional hearing as Kristi Noem, the U.S. Homeland Security Secretary and former South Dakota governor, calmly defended her leadership, her voice steady and controlled. Behind her, her husband, Bryon Noem, sat quietly, almost fading into the background. But elsewhere, a different story was unfolding. Under the name Jason Jackson, a digital trail revealed $25,000 sent through PayPal to fetish accounts, according to reporting by Hindustan Times. What looked like a perfect political image suddenly felt carefully staged. And the cracks didn't begin with photos, but with a single voicemail that reached the wrong place. The voicemail, smoking gun. March 31, 2026, was the day the floor completely fell out from under the Noem family. While the political world was still reeling from Kristi Noem's sudden removal as Homeland Security Secretary just weeks earlier, the Daily Mail dropped an investigative piece that felt like it belonged in a surrealist novel rather than a political column. Ben Ashford and Josh Boswell, two investigative journalists at the Daily Mail who have a reputation for digging through the digital trash of the elite, spent months tracking a ghost. They weren't looking for political corruption in the traditional sense, but they found something that effectively paralyzed the GOP's family values machine overnight. The name that kept surfacing in the deepest, most niche corners of the internet was Jason Jackson. For over 14 months, this character existed as a high-spending regular in what insiders called the bimbofication fetish community. If you aren't familiar with that term, it basically involves a fetishization of hyper-feminine, surgically enhanced appearances, often involving exaggerated features and a very specific aesthetic. Jason Jackson wasn't just a lurker in these forums, he was a benefactor. According to the investigation led by Ashford and Boswell, this pseudonym was linked to a PayPal account that funneled at least $25,000 to various models. These weren't small, one-off tips either, as the records showed consistent deposits ranging from $500 to $1,000 at a time, often sent when the Jason persona felt particularly generous or needed more attention from the performers. Now, here is where it got really interesting for the forensics team. When the story first broke, the immediate defense from the Noem camp and from her supporters online was that the images were AI-generated. They argued that it was a hit job, a deep fake designed to humiliate a conservative icon. But the Daily Mail didn't just dump the photos. They brought the receipts. They had experts analyze the metadata of the files, and those digital fingerprints told a story that was impossible to scrub. The photos of a man wearing pink hot pants, fake breasts, and pouting for the camera weren't generated by a computer in 2026. They were snapped in early 2025 on an iPhone that was set to Central Time, which just happened to be the exact time zone of the Noem Ranch in South Dakota. Everything about the location data was consistent with Bryon Noem's movements. But wait, it actually got weirder. You might wonder how an insurance mogul and the husband of a cabinet member could be so careless with his digital identity. It turns out he wasn't just using a pseudonym. He was using his real-world infrastructure to support his secret life. According to the report, one of the models involved in the explicit chats actually had a moment of accidental clarity. She told the investigators that she once pocket-dialed the number Jason Jackson had provided for their private communication. Instead of a generic Jason answering or a standard robotic greeting, the call went straight to a business voicemail that said, "Noem Insurance, leave a message." Think about that for a second. The man who was supposedly hiding a double life had linked his fetish identity to his primary family business. It was a level of technical arrogance that even the most seasoned investigators found hard to believe. It meant that while his wife was managing the nation's security, Bryon was managing a digital alter ego that was one misplaced click away from total exposure. The models themselves eventually started to put the pieces together. realizing that the Jason who was praising their surgically enhanced bodies and sending $1,000 deposits was the same man sitting behind the governor of South Dakota at public events. I found myself wondering if any of you actually believed the AI defense when you first saw those headlines. It's the go-to excuse for every public figure caught in a scandal these days, but when you have a business voicemail and metadata from an iPhone, that defense starts to look pretty thin. The investigators also found that when payments were delayed, the models would get frustrated and push for more info, which led to Jason sharing more personal details to keep them on the hook. He wasn't just buying photos, he was buying a sense of being known, even if it was under a fake name. The financial trail was the final nail. Those regular $500 deposits weren't coming from an offshore account. They were traceable, consistent, and frequent. It showed a lifestyle that had been going on for over a year, right under the nose of the Department of Homeland Security's vetting process. But as devastating as the Jason Jackson identity was, the photos were only the beginning. It was the content of the messages that truly turned this from a personal kink into a political execution. The psychological collapse. Once the voicemail tied the Jason Jackson account back to the Noem household, the story stopped being about whether it was real and started becoming something far more uncomfortable. It became about why it existed in the first place. Because on the surface, the Noems had built a very specific image. Kristi Noem, serving at the highest levels of U.S. government, had consistently framed her public life around God, family, country, a message that resonated deeply with her political base. Bryon, an insurance executive from South Dakota, had always appeared to fit neatly into that picture. A supportive spouse, grounded, private, steady. That was the version people saw. But behind that, the messages told a completely different story. According to reporting by Hindustan Times, which reviewed portions of the alleged chat logs, Bryon, under the Jason Jackson alias, had spoken openly with online models about the state of his marriage, and not in vague terms or coded language. He described a relationship where he felt sidelined, where decisions were happening around him rather than with him, and where he no longer felt in control of his own home. Now, here's where it got complicated. The name Corey Lewandowski started appearing in those conversations. Lewandowski, known as a political advisor closely associated with Kristi Noem, had already been the subject of public speculation long before this scandal broke. But in these private exchanges, according to the same Hindustan Times report, Bryon didn't treat it as speculation. He spoke about it as something he already knew. And that shifted the entire context. Because instead of a husband discovering something after the fact, the messages suggested someone who had been aware, who had processed it, and who had, in his own words, felt powerless to do anything about it. That sense of powerlessness kept coming up, not just once, but across multiple conversations, like a thread running through everything he said. Think about that for a second. A man publicly tied to a message of stability and traditional values was privately describing a situation where those very values had already broken down inside his own marriage. According to a report hosted on Graphopedagogy, which analyzed what it referred to as the I Know interview transcripts, Bryon had gone even further in one exchange with an online model. He didn't deny the situation, didn't deflect, didn't try to reframe it. He simply acknowledged it. The phrasing was direct, almost resigned, as if he had reached a point where denial wasn't even useful anymore. And that tone matters, because it gives you a glimpse into the mindset behind the Jason Jackson persona. This wasn't just someone chasing anonymity for the sake of it. It started to look more like an escape route, a controlled environment where he could say things he couldn't say publicly, where he could reshape how he was perceived, even if only temporarily. In that space, he wasn't the husband of a cabinet official. He wasn't the quiet figure sitting behind the cameras. He was someone else entirely, someone who could express frustration, vulnerability, even resentment, without consequences spilling into his real life. But of course, That separation didn't actually exist. According to discussions archived on Reddit's Faux Moi community, where users compiled and analyzed fragments of the alleged chats, there was a noticeable pattern in how Bryon presented himself. He oscillated between confidence and insecurity, sometimes leaning into the fantasy of control, other times admitting he felt completely blindsided by the changes in his personal life. Even though Reddit itself isn't a primary source, the patterns they highlighted lined up closely with details reported elsewhere, which made them harder to dismiss outright. And that's where the psychological picture started to come together. You had a man who, by all outward appearances, was part of a powerful political partnership, yet privately described himself as someone who had been overtaken by forces he couldn't control. His wife's rise in national politics, her close working relationship with high-profile advisors, and the increasing public scrutiny all seemed to have shifted the balance inside their marriage. And instead of confronting it directly, he retreated into a parallel identity where he could rewrite the narrative, even if only in fragments. The problem is, those fragments didn't stay contained. Because once investigators confirmed the identity behind Jason Jackson, those conversations stopped being private confessions and started becoming evidence. Evidence of a personal situation that directly contradicted the public image. And more importantly, evidence of vulnerability. And that's the part that went beyond personal drama. What looked like a broken marriage, complicated and messy in its own right, suddenly intersected with something much larger. Because when someone in that position exposed their private struggles in a traceable, monetized digital environment, it didn't just stay personal. It created openings, risks that extended far beyond the household itself. And as this story unfolded, that realization hit hard. The emotional fallout inside the marriage quickly became secondary, because the moment intelligence agencies started looking at those transactions and conversations, the question wasn't about relationships anymore. It was about what those vulnerabilities meant for national security. The national security failure. The tragedy of a crumbling marriage was one thing, but the moment this story moved from the Noems' private ranch in South Dakota to the secure briefing rooms in Washington, everything changed. We weren't just looking at a husband with a secret identity anymore. We were looking at a massive, glaring hole in the national security of the United States. Here's the thing about high-level government positions like the Secretary of Homeland Security. You don't just get the job because you're a popular politician. You get it because you, and everyone close to you, are supposed to be unblackmailable. Now here is where it got really interesting, and frankly, a bit terrifying. According to an analysis by Mark Polymeropoulos, a veteran who spent 26 years in the CIA and specialized in clandestine operations, the Jason Jackson persona was a textbook case of what intelligence officers call a vulnerability. In the world of espionage, there is an old acronym called MICE, which stands for money, ideology, coercion, and ego. These are the four pillars spies use to flip people. Bryon Noem's secret life managed to hit at least 3 of those. When you have the spouse of a cabinet member spending $25,000 on fetish sites while using a fake name, you aren't just looking at a personal hobby. You are looking at a gold mine for foreign intelligence services like the SVR or the MSS. Think about that for a second. While Kristi Noem was sitting in meetings discussing border security and domestic threats, her husband was out there in the digital wild, leaving a trail of financial transactions and explicit photos that could have been used to ruin her career in an afternoon. Jack Barsky, a man who actually lived as a KGB sleeper agent during the Cold War before eventually becoming a U.S. citizen and a counterintelligence consultant, pointed out something that made a lot of people in D.C. very nervous. He explained that if a couple of tabloid journalists from the Daily Mail could track down Jason Jackson using basic digital forensics, then professional spies in Moscow or Beijing likely had that information in a folder years ago. And get this, the technical reality of this kind of compromat is that you don't even have to use it to make it effective. The mere existence of those photos and those PayPal logs meant that Bryon was a target for coercion. Any foreign agent who stumbled onto that Noem Insurance voicemail link could have reached out to him and told him that his secret stayed safe as long as he provided a little bit of information, or perhaps just influenced a conversation at the dinner table. It turned the second gentleman of South Dakota into a liability that the American government simply couldn't afford to have around. Now, everyone wanted to know how the vetting process failed so spectacularly. When someone is nominated for a cabinet position, they go through a background check that is supposed to be incredibly intrusive. They look at your finances, your travel, and your close associates. But according to a report by the Hindustan Times that analyzed the security vetting gap, there was a blind spot when it came to the private digital lives of spouses. The internal review panels at the DHS were supposed to be the final line of defense, but they apparently focused more on Kristi's public record and less on what was happening on the home Wi-Fi in Castlewood. It actually got weirder when you looked at the timeline of her removal. In March 2026, the official word from the administration was that there was a reshuffling of the leadership team. But behind the scenes, as reported by CBS News, the decision to remove Kristi Noem as DHS Secretary was directly tied to the discovery of the Jason Jackson files. It wasn't a policy disagreement. It wasn't a political move. It was a silent firing triggered by a security clearance that was no longer tenable. The government realized that the person holding the keys to the country's domestic defense was married to a man whose secret life had effectively turned him into a back door for anyone who wanted to bypass the front gate. Every legend has a hero, but in this story, the system itself was the one that had to play the villain to protect itself. Do you think the government was right to force her out for something her husband did? Or should she have been allowed to stay since she wasn't the one with the secret identity? Here is the most uncomfortable truth of the whole situation. If those $25,000 in payments had been caught by the FBI during the initial vetting process, Kristi Noem probably would have never been confirmed in the first place. But because they weren't caught until they hit the front page of a newspaper, the damage was already done. The trust was gone. It wasn't the affair or the cross-dressing itself that ended her career. It was the simple, cold fact that in the eyes of the intelligence community, she was no longer safe to hold the keys to the country. And as it turned out, the transition from the highest levels of power to political exile happened a lot faster than anyone expected. The fallout and the shield. By March 24, 2026, the political reality for Kristi Noem had shifted so violently that her previous life as the face of American domestic security felt like a distant memory. It wasn't just a resignation. It was a total structural purge. The administration didn't even wait for the dust to settle before it moved Markwayne Mullin, the former senator from Oklahoma, into her office to take over the Department of Homeland Security. While the official press releases spoke about new directions and continuity of leadership, everyone in the room knew this was a containment strategy. The system she was hired to manage, the very machine designed to identify and neutralize internal threats, had essentially identified her own household as the threat, and it didn't hesitate to cut her loose. But here is where it gets interesting, and honestly, a bit cynical. Instead of just showing her the door, they created a soft landing to keep her quiet. Kristi was transitioned into a newly minted role called the Special Envoy for the Shield of the Americas. Now, on paper, that sounds incredibly prestigious, almost cinematic. But think about it for a second. In the brutal hierarchy of D by C, a special envoy position with a vague, grand-sounding title is usually code for a political waiting room. It was a face-saving move by the Trump administration to avoid a messy public firing that would have energized the opposition during an election cycle. They essentially moved her from the engine room of the country to a decorative seat on the observation deck, where she couldn't touch the controls anymore. While the politicians were busy playing musical chairs with cabinet seats, the human cost was quietly unfolding back in South Dakota. You have to remember that this wasn't just about a governor and her husband. There were 3 adult children caught in the middle of this digital wreckage. Cassidy, Kennedy, and Booker Noem had spent their lives being the faces of a perfect Midwestern family, often appearing in campaign ads that touted traditional ranching values. Now, they were forced to issue pleas for privacy, as the Jason Jackson files became the most talked-about topic in the country. According to local reports from the Sioux Falls area, the reaction in their hometown of Castlewood was a mix of genuine heartbreak and stunned silence. People there didn't just see a news story, they saw a neighbor's life disintegrate in real time. And get this, the uncomfortable truth that nobody wanted to say out loud was that Kristi Noem's career didn't just die because of a scandal. It died because of a paradox. The Department of Homeland Security is built on the idea that secrets are vulnerabilities. If you can't secure your own home Wi-Fi or your spouse's digital identity, the institutional logic says you can't be trusted with the nation's secrets. It's a cold, mechanical reality that doesn't care about 34 years of marriage or political loyalty. We talk a lot about cancel culture, but this was something different. This was security culture, doing exactly what it was designed to do. Every legend has a hero, but in the case of the Noems, the hero was the vetting process that eventually caught up with them. The story of the Noems eventually faded from the headlines, but the $25,000 digital trail and that haunting admission of powerlessness remained as a permanent record of a marriage and a career that simply couldn't withstand the lights.